Welcome to Seek Reality with Roberta Grimes. Joyous conversations about what the afterlife evidence and modern science combine to tell us is true about our one reality. You have nothing to fear. You are eternal and you are perfectly loved. Knowing the truth changes everything. Now, here's Roberta.
Welcome to Seek Reality. I'm Roberta Grimes, and I'm so glad you're with us today. One of our most venerable afterlife researchers is Michael Tymn. He made a name for himself as a respected expert in the field of 19th and early 20th century afterlife communications, almost at once. He wrote 6 terrific books that are classics, and it only took him 5 years. I'm amazed. Let's talk about his books. They're called The Afterlife Revealed, What Happens After We Die, that came out in 2011, Transcending the Titanic, Beyond Death's Door, 2012, The Afterlife Explorers, The Pioneers of Psychical Research, another 2012 book. He had twins that year. Resurrecting Leonora Piper, How Science Discovered the Afterlife, 2013. Dead Men Talking, Afterlife Communications from World War I, 2014. And The Articulate Dead, They Brought the Spirit World Alive, 2015. These books are wonderful because they are about actual research. They're precise, they're detailed, they're very entertaining, very easy to read. And I recommend, frankly, that you read all 6. So I'm going to put them in the information with today's podcast. I'm hearing from many people now who tell me how badly they want to become certain, 100%, that their lives really are eternal. And I think the only way to do that, to develop that level of certainty, is to read a lot of primary source materials and books that are based on primary source materials. So I hope you'll read all 6 of Michael's books. And, of course, as part of his effort to catalog the modern history of afterlife communications, Michael has just produced, and I've seen it, it's amazing, the first detailed schedule of how this science developed that I've ever seen. There may be others. I've never seen them. His schedule covers 6 pages, single space, and it goes back to the 11th century. One of the things we'll be talking about today is how this field developed and flowered in the 19th and early 20th centuries as those that we used to think were dead, and they're not, began their apparent effort, it's pretty clear this is ongoing, to raise awareness of our eternal life all over the world. Very early in my research, I stumbled upon some old books by researchers who had worked a century ago that contained wonderful and amazingly consistent communications received through Deep Trance Mediums in the very early 20th century. And the volume and consistency of those accounts were what first convinced me that we really do survive our death. We're going to talk about those communications and others that were received around the same time today. Michael's books contain all that same level of information, but it's in a form that's much easier to use than what I had way back when. Oh, dear Michael, I'm so glad you're here. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, Roberta. I very much appreciate it.
Now, let's talk first about your history a little bit, because some people may not have heard you on Seek Reality before, and then they wonder how you got into this field and what drew you to it. Because you were in insurance, right? You had like a regular day job.
I majored in journalism in college, but I spent 3 years in the Marine Corps. When I got out of the Marine Corps in 1961, there were newspapers are closing right and left because of TV was becoming big at the time. So I ended up in insurance claims management for 40 years, although I did a lot of freelance writing along the way, covering mostly sports. I was a long-distance runner and did a lot of writing for running magazines and for the local paper on running events, swimming and triathlons and so forth over the years. So I always had 2 careers. One is in insurance claims management, and the other in as a freelance writer. But writing has always been my first love. It didn't make as much money as I did in, not that I made all that much in insurance, but insurance claims management was my primary field. But anyway, as far as my beliefs, I grew up in the Catholic Church and just gradually grew away from the church during my 20s, I guess it was, and always felt a need to, have some identification with a religion. And I tried several Protestant churches, they didn't work for me. And then there was a period, I guess, during my 40s that, I didn't belong to anything, but I kept looking for books. I remember reading Dr. Raymond Moody's book, in 1975 or 76, right after it came out on near-death experiences, and I read a lot of Carlos Castaneda and Cosmic Consciousness and other books like that, but it really didn't develop until 1989. I was on a trip to New York, and coincidentally my wife had a conference in Atlanta, Georgia that same weekend, and I took a train from New York City down to Atlanta and stopped in Washington, D.C., and looked for a book, and it was an Edgar Cayce book on reincarnation. I read that on the train, and that whetted the appetite. My initial reading was, all in reincarnation, and then I went from there to near-death experiences, and from near-death experiences to mediumship, and I found mediumship the most interesting. I took a few trips to England and went to a place called Hay-on-Wye. It's called the used book capital of the world. It's about 4 hours drive from London, and it's a little town that has about maybe 50 shops in all, and about half of those shops, 25 or 30 of them, are used bookstores. So on my first trip there, I brought back a whole suitcase. That's when you could have more than one suitcase.
Right.
Books, maybe 25 or 30, and read them all, and that's sort of how it got started. And along the way, it was all very confusing. There was just so much confusion that it didn't make sense to me, and I had to read some of the books 2 or 3 times to get, to try and understand them. It was never really made clear by the writers the difference between direct voice and trans voice and so forth. They just sort of assumed that the reader knew what they were talking about. So
that's right.
As a journalist, I felt, I got to try and put this in layman's language so others can understand it. And so that's how it all started.
Wow. Well, I have to give you a lot of credit because you're right. The books from the early part of the 20th century assume that you know all about what they're doing. And what was frustrating to me, what was my favorite was what Gladys, Osborne, Leonard, and Charles Drayton Thomas. I just loved them, and I read 4 of their books repeatedly, just because there was so much richness in them. There was so much that the dead were saying that I had never heard or imagined before. But there were a few things that really griped me because nobody asked them questions. And this was, of course, 100 years ago that they had answered the questions. No way to get an answer now. One of the things that I couldn't see they ever said, Michael, was, is it solid there? I mean, is it like here? And, of course, we know that it is, but it took me probably years before I found people who actually answered that question. Did you have that kind of problem, too, when you were first doing this?
Yeah. It just, it was very difficult trying to link everything together and get try to visualize it. I have to visualize something, to understand it. That's what I try to do in my books is to present it in a way that the reader can visualize it. But so much of it is beyond human comprehension that you can only go so far in that respect.
Yeah. I mean, we always have to remember we have these very limited minds while we're here, and we're trying to understand these enormous concepts. But what I love about those 6 books is that you write so entertainingly. There's nothing dense or heavy. It's like candy. It reads very easily, very much as if you feel you're on top of it. And I know that's hard to do because I'm a writer too. So my hat goes off to you for that.
Yeah. I think that goes back to majoring in journalism in college, trying to, I find when I joined this organization some years ago in 1999, I think it was, after I won an essay contest, and found myself with a number of academics, and I was asked to be editor of their publication, and all their writing was, academic. It started, it was, started at one point, and you didn't know what it was all about until the end. And in journalism school, we're taught to, state in the first paragraph what this is all
Yes.
about, and then explain it. And
Right,
that's
exactly.
you
So
know.
they can shorten the article if they have to give it. You don't
Right.
have to go over to another page. Oh, yeah, I remember it well. Oh my goodness. Well, I think what you've done in really a relatively short career in this field, you have. I think you have the deepest understanding of a lot of things, of just about anyone, and partly it's because you've concentrated so much in that period of time. You call it psychical research, and I know many of the older researchers do call it psychical research. I call it afterlife research, which is probably dumb. But what's the difference? Is there a difference in your mind?
Well, I call it survival research, or if I want to really make it specific, survival research. But psychical research didn't necessarily focus on survival per se. Maybe we should jump ahead to the 1930s when psychical research became parapsychology. What happened is that a lot of the researchers of the time just became so frustrated with psychical research that they narrowed it down. They just took out the survival part of it, the spirit part of it, which really irritated scientists. I mean, they didn't want anything to do with survival or with spirit, so they limited it to ESP and psychokinetics, and that became parapsychology. And parapsychology went on from 1930s to 1995, and somewhere along the line, I'm not sure what year, the scientists said, we don't like the word parapsychology because scientists make fun of it, so we're going to become consciousness researchers. Yes. And right. So, there's a lot of names. Even before psychical research, I think psychical research got the name in 1882 when the Society for Psychical Research was formed. Yes. In London. But before that, there's research going on for 30 some odd years, and really didn't have any name. It was just, investigation of mediums. I'm not aware of any name they gave to it, but in effect, psychical research was just investigating anything that was psychic or paranormal, fell outside the bounds of mainstream science.
But they never really respected it. Even those doing the research, as you say, they sort of didn't. They saw it as almost frivolous, not as a serious area of research. When to me, don't you think it's a tremendously serious area of research and a very important one? So I find that very frustrating in the scientific community.
Yeah. Well, there were some of the researchers like Sir Oliver Lodge and Dr. James Hislop and so forth who recognized that it's the most important thing there is.
That's right. Right.
And even somewhere along the line, or before his death, Sigmund Freud, who was a big disbeliever and atheist and so forth, said that if he had to go back and live his life all over again, he'd become a psychical research because he recognized that, that was much more important than anything he had been studying, but it was too late for him.
Freud. Oh, yeah, he was a character in many ways. But it really seems, this modern period really seems to have begun around at the early part of the 1800s. I love your timeline, by the way. I've been playing with it, and because I know who a lot of these people are, but I never thought of them as fitting together in a timeline, and they certainly do. Can you talk a little bit about how this modern interest, modern in that it started in the early 1800s, how it developed, this interest in life after death and in communicating with the dead? Yeah,
well, my timeline starts actually with the 11th century AD, which with the Catholic Church setting down guidelines for the investigation of miracles necessary for sainthood. And in thinking about it recently, I believe the miracles that I heard about when I was a member of the Catholic Church really kept me linked to this whole area. I mean, the apparitions of Blessed Virgin Mary and so forth in Guadalupe and Lourdes and Medjugorje and so forth. I heard all about those in, well, not Medjugorje, that didn't start until late 1982, but there always seemed to be something to those that made me realize, even though the rest of the church teachings didn't make sense, there was something to those miracles that made me want to find out more about them. And I think those, studying those miracles led me to want to find out more about the whole paranormal and psychic area. And, as I said, the Catholic Church set down these guidelines in the 11th century, and there wasn't much taking place over the next 500 or 600 years until Emanuel Swedenborg. I've got on my timeline 1741. Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a famous Swedish scientist, he began his personal investigations of the afterlife. He was able to clairvoyantly, or it's not really clear whether it was clairvoyant or he did out-of-body travel, but he wrote 7 or 8 books on what he found in his clairvoyant experiences, and that was, some consider that the beginning of what is called spiritualism.
1741.
1741, and then in 1778 there was Mesmerism, which was initially frowned upon by most physicians, hypnotism in effect.
Yes.
And that helped people go into an altered state of consciousness and come up with strange things that they couldn't figure out where all these
right.
This information was coming from, but they didn't really link that to psychical research until another 40 or 50 years later, but it set the foundation for it. 1826, there was a doctor, a German physician named Justinus Kerner, who studied a clairvoyant in his village in Germany known as Friederike Hoff, also called the Seeress of Prevost, I guess it is. And he wrote a book about that in 1829, and that was published in English in 1845. And then 1840, we've got Dr. Karl von Reichenbach, who was a German chemist. He began doing research with various sensitives on what he called an invisible energy field that came to be called odic force, or simply ode. And he published his findings in 1845, which confirmed that various mind over matters achievements were possible by these sensitives. 1847, Andrew Jackson Davis published a book, The Principles of Nature, in which he talked about various psychic phenomena that he supposedly came to him from Emanuel Swedenborg, who was by that time in the spirit world.
Sometime around this time, or maybe in the 1870s, it became a fad for people to do table tipping, to do other kinds of communicating with beings not in bodies. I remember reading about that, and that seemed to be how some of the great late 19th, early 20th century deep trance mediums really developed, that they seem to have developed their abilities in these table tipping sessions they would do after dinner in the fashionable, London homes and in New York. Do you know much about that period? Because that all seems to have begun with the Fox sisters in Hydesville, New York. The key date there is March 31st, 1848, when these two young sisters started with knocking in their house, in their bedroom. They couldn't figure out what the knocking was, and then they somehow realized somebody was trying to communicate with them, and they figured out that 2 knocks, one knock meant no, and 2 knocks meant yes, and 3 knocks meant I don't know or whatever. And so they started communicating with this spirit entity, and they called their parents in and they called neighbors in and so forth, and they all figured out that they were communicating with a man that had been buried in that house 30 or 40 years earlier. I forget the exact time, but and that was the real beginning of spiritualism, and it just spread rapidly throughout the United States and in England and France and Germany and various other places. And according to
various messages, the spirit world prompted it. There was actually Emanuel Swedenborg and Benjamin Franklin on the other side felt the need to communicate, to get across. At that time, this Darwinism came to us in 1859, I guess it was, and even before that, there's the a big loss of faith among scientists, and somehow the spirit world determined that they needed to get across the message that there is a spirit world and then that they're there. And supposedly, according to the messages, Swedenborg and Benjamin Franklin figured out how to get these raps through to people, and that's how it all began, and it just really spread like wildfire. I think it reached a peak about in the 1870s and 1880s.
Right.
So the first real psychical researchers, I've always said was Judge John Edmonds, who was Chief Justice of the New York State Supreme Court in 1851. He had lost his wife, and he had, people had recommended to him that he go see some mediums, and he thought that was just, so much hogwash. But he decided to investigate. He went to mediums, and information came through that was beyond research, and he had no way of being able to or to debunk these people. It just it was information that nobody else knew. And so anyway, that prompted Judge Edmonds to continue his research for over 2 years, and he became a believer. In fact, he became a medium himself. But there was another man, Aidan Ballou, who was a American Unitarian minister who began his research about the same time, maybe even before Judge Edmonds, who wrote I think, is the first book on the subject. It's got a long title, An Exposition of Views Reflecting the Principal Facts, Causes, and Peculiarities Involved in Spirit Manifestations, together with interesting phenomenal statements and communication. Anyway, either Aidan Ballou or John Edmonds, they were the first real psychical researchers well before 1882.
Let's talk about the because what seems to have been happening in the early part of the 20th century was that the spirits were trying to prove to the scientists who were stonewalling them that in fact they existed. So they did book tests and other ways of proving, because they're so dishonest and dishonorable. These scientists kept saying that it was impossible to read minds in the 19th century, and then when all these wonderful, great communications came through, Gladys, Osborne, Leonard, and others, they immediately said, "Oh, that's just mind reading. They're reading the minds of the people in the room, so they know what all about their dead loved ones." We talk about dishonorable, but I was fascinated to find. Charles Drayton Thomas was the young man he's a minister, who researched Gladys, and I was fascinated to find his books because one of them, I think it was the one in 1928, was nothing but book tests. They would say, go to a room in this house where no one's ever been, and there's a bookcase here, and pull out a book, and and this is which book, and then on page 27, third line down, this is what it says. And a lot of the times that they were right about what it said. And he later on said that he thought every time that they missed was probably his mistake. He had misheard what they had said. How did they do the book tests? That's crazy.
Yeah, they were the book tests with Gladys, Osborne, and Leonard took place about 1917 to 1920 or something like that.
Maybe it was a 1922 book, which was Some New Evidence for Human Survival.
Yeah, but there were some book tests well before that. I don't recall the exact details of one that was reported back in the 1850s by Professor I think it's Charles Mapes. He was a disbeliever, but both his wife and his daughter had become mediums, and in one case, his daughter told him that his father, who was in spirit, was communicating and told him to go to a certain book which was in his shed outside and in a box that he hadn't opened in 35 years or so, and to open to page 32, and he would find the father's signature. So Professor Mapes followed up, went to the shed, opened, went to that very page, and there was his father's signature on that page.
Amazing.
And,
Isn't that amazing?
Then, yeah. But
so,
that, of course, the scientists would say that, Professor Mapes saw it 30 years earlier, and it was in his subconscious, and so it's not veridical or proof of somebody communicating with him. But when we get to those by Gladys, Osborne, and Leonard, this was information coming through. The spirit, or the communicating spirit, would say to go to the fourth book on the lowest shelf,
right.
and open it, and on page 202 you'd find certain words. But these were books that Charles Drayton Thomas, the investigator, had never seen before.
Yes, I couldn't get over it. Yes. And often they were in a house where he had never been. They had to knock on the door and say, do you mind if we go check a book in your library?
Right.
I was staggered by that. And yet even the scientists, it seems that when they got to the point where the evidence was so strong, they just started to stonewall it.
Right.
That was when they made science the fundamental, materialism, the fundamental dogma of science. And they called it that. You can see that in print back then. The materialism is the fundamental dogma of science.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a dogma, you're just a religion. It's terrible.
Right. And one of the problems with the book test is they didn't always get the exact wording.
Yes.
The communicating spirit would say, "I'm seeing an ocean or a sky," or something like that, and then the person would go to that particular page and get verbiage that indicated an ocean or sky, but it wasn't, verbatim as to
yes. Oh, yeah.
Exactly what as I read in the book. So that was ammunition enough for the scientists to say this is just so much bogus. I mean, we can't accept it. That
was terrible. But there were wonderful communications that came through her. Could you explain how these deep trance mediums worked? Her control was called FIDA, I think.
Yeah. Gladys, Osborne, Leonard, and Leonora Piper were probably the two most famous trance mediums. They would sit down and just go into a passive state. Their eyeballs would roll back in their head, and all of a sudden another voice would come through them. Their so-called spirit control would take over their body and speak through them, and they had no recollection of it all. When they came back to consciousness, they knew nothing of what happened.
But the loved one, the people in the room who had come for a sitting, and wanted to hear from their loved one would be talking to FIDA, so they got much better information than you get through a modern, mental medium. It seemed as if it was much more sort of detailed and real. They almost could just carry on a conversation.
Yeah. There's much more than just a word here too that get full paragraphs, and there were really four parties involved. There was the sitter, the medium, and then the spirit control, who was taking over the body of the medium, and then the communicating spirit. Now, in some cases, they, some of the spirits didn't require a control. They were able to communicate directly themselves. They figured it all out, and I guess it's just like, some people here can effectively meditate and some can't. I'm not a meditator. I can't do it. I don't have the patience. I fall asleep. I fall asleep if I try to meditate. But some people are effective meditators, and I guess when you get on that side, they're effective communicators. But most of them, most of the souls on that side can't directly communicate and require somebody to help them out and be a so-called medium on that side of the veil.
Well, one of the things I loved about reading those books was that there were real conversations going on, just as you would have a conversation, at a dinner table or something, with emotion and just real talking. It was as if the person had not died at all. And
right.
I thought, I just wish it were possible for that to go on today, because nowadays people would respect that a lot more than they did back then.
Right. Yeah, I guess there's still some of it going on, but we don't hear much about it because science has dismissed it, and science is not interested in it. And the other problem is that it does require a certain harmony. Once you get the debunkers in there, the skeptical scientists
yes.
put pressure on the mediums. They try too hard, and it doesn't come through.
Yes,
that was one of the biggest things that the early scientists found out, that there had to be harmony, and you had to, if you brought somebody in who really doubted or was very skeptical, that somehow interfered with the vibes coming through, and the sessions just weren't that effective when there was a real skeptic there. Of course, the skeptics would say, well, it's because it's not real in the first place. It's nothing to do with harmony. One of the more interesting stories.
No, go ahead, tell your story. But I just wanted
I was going to say one of the more interesting stories was that of
Hammer. I think that's something we want to emphasize to everyone. It's without spiritual harmony, without positive energy in the whole transaction, nothing works. And that's different, of course, from test tubes, and that's one of the reasons science has had so much trouble. Go ahead, Michael. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, no, I was going to say number one, relate it to baseball. I like to bring in baseball every now and then, and good baseball players say when they try to hit home runs, they don't do it. It's when they relax and just try to make contact is when they hit the home runs. And I think that's the same way in mediumship. When you get these mediums, you put the pressure on them with people studying them. They try too hard, and it doesn't work as well. It works. Some of them works okay, but when they try too hard, then nothing comes through. And same thing as trying to hit a baseball. Just try too hard, and it doesn't work. But one of the more interesting cases was a researcher named Hamlin Garland. He came upon a real good trans medium in Los Angeles. This was around, I think it was around 1898 or somewhere around there. And the first two times he sat with, somebody told him about her and told him that she was a very good medium. He sat with her the first time and nothing came through. I guess he was so skeptical that nothing came through.
Yeah, he could block it.
But he tried a second time and a little bit came through, but it wasn't all that much. But then the third time he got quite a bit, and he became convinced that she was a true medium. He arranged to take her back to Boston to demonstrate her ability before a group of researchers, mostly skeptics, very skeptical people. And first time she sat with him, nothing happened. Second time, nothing happened. So they wrote her off as a fraud. But Garland had put a lot of money into it at that point, and talked to one of the researchers. His name escapes me right now, but he was a professor of physics at Tufts University. To come to or to go to his house, to the professor's house. There were four people there. There was Garland's wife, the professor, and the professor's wife, and the medium, 5 people. And they sat there for 45 minutes. Nothing happened. And the professor said, well, isn't it time to give up? And Garland said, no, let's just wait a little longer. And somewhere around an hour and 15 minutes, things started flying around. The books started flying off the shelves. Things started flying across the room and landing on the table. And then they started hearing voices. And a voice came through claiming to be, and I can't remember his name now, Brigadier General, somebody other from the Civil War who had died 20 years earlier. And he carried on a conversation with the 4 of them for over an hour. giving him all kinds of details. So Garland made a record of that, talks about it in his book. But the physics professor, he wanted nothing to do with it. He didn't mention it to his friends or anything else. I mean, it was just too far out, and he felt his credibility would be affected if he told his colleagues about this strange experience in his house.
So let's talk about Leonora Piper, because your book about her has covered the afterlife. Please tell that story a little bit. And who was she? And was she as good as Gladys? Because I just thought Gladys was wonderful.
I think she was as good, or maybe even a little better. I mean, probably more research was carried out with Leonora than with Gladys, and she was before Gladys, so that's why she stands out more in the annals of psychical research. But she was discovered by William James, Professor William James of Harvard University, in somewhere around I forget the exact year, 1885 or 1884, somewhere around there. His wife had, William James's wife had heard about this woman that lived in the same neighborhood in Boston, who had some clairvoyant abilities, and told him about it. So he arranged a sitting with Leonora, and information came through to William James that Leonora could not possibly have known. So William James began to, believe there was something there, although he considered it all telepathy, that Leonora was reading his mind.
Right.
Then along the line, some information came through that he didn't even know about. And then they came up with this theory that they had to remain scientific. So it had to come up with some scientific theory, and they call it teleoteropathy or something like that, that the medium could read the minds of anybody in the world. They could, their consciousness could drift 1,500 miles away and dig into the mind of somebody there and come up with the information. And when that didn't totally explain it, they talked about some sort of cosmic consciousness, that there's some field in the ethers that you can tap into and get any information you want and feed it back. But it was and most of the researchers bought into this because it was more scientific than believing in spirits. They didn't want to believe in spirits because it was not scientific. And then the turning point on that was in 1892 when a man named George Pellew, Pellew, who was a member of the Society of Psychical Research in New York. He was a reporter. He also had a law degree and was writing for the New York. I forget which newspaper it was, but he was 32 years old. And one night he went home and fell down. I think he must have been drunk or something, and fell down the stairs in his apartment and died. And Dr. Richard Hodgson, who was at that time head of the Society of Psychical Research in New York, decided to try. He knew him. He had talked to him before, when he was alive, and knew him, and tried to communicate with him about 3 weeks after his death. And sure enough, George Pellew started communicating, giving him all kinds of details as to his life, about his life, and detail which Richard Hodgson didn't know. And then, Hodgson started bringing in people who knew George Pellew, and they started communicating with him. In fact, over a period of a year or year and a half, Hodgson brought in something like 30 people who knew Pellew, and he communicated with all of them. Very, very detailed. And I just decided, this goes beyond mind read. This is, there's too much personality involved. There was too much personality involved, too much volition and so forth, that it had to go beyond mind reading. And that seemed to be the turning point. Sir Oliver Lodge and other researchers of the time accepted that, and William James sort of remained on the fence, all his life. He didn't really come out in favor of the spirit hypotheses because I think he was afraid that he'd lose respect in his profession as a psychologist, psychiatrist, and So he remained on the fence all his life, although indications were he did believe there were spirits there.
Yeah, no, he's certainly a major figure in the history of this field. For someone who was kind of skeptical his whole life, that's really what he's most famous for now. Most of the other stuff he did, I think, is mostly forgotten. But so Leonora Piper was more able to take the pressure of being studied. Is that why some scientists maybe came to respect her?
I think so. She seemed to lose the ability somewhere around the the early 1900s. Most of these good mediums, they seem to retain the ability for a number of years, and then they lose it. She began to lose it around 1910 or so, and then she was tested at that time by some other scientists, and they concluded that she was a fraud, and so even though there's all this other evidential information over a period of 20 years, or actually Richard Hodgson, the primary investigator, he investigated for 18 years on the average of 3 times a week for 18 years. I don't know how many sittings he had with her, but there was he started as a skeptic. I mean, he was out to debunk Leonora Piper, but he soon became a believer, and as I said, he initially believed it was all mental telepathy, but then after George Pellew came through, he became a convert to the spirit hypotheses, and continued to investigate her until he died in 1905, and then several months after his death, he began communicating through Leonora Piper with William James and with others. But
amazing.
There were still those who doubted, and some of the information was sort of vague, and most of the scientists expected it to be straight facts that are indisputable.
Right.
But yeah.
The point is, it's not up to them to set the standards and set the parameters. It's up to they can't do that when they study a black hole, can they? They have to study it in the way the black hole needs to be studied. And they never understood that this is just like studying a black hole. It's so ridiculous. But you say that you do research that are not taught in Sunday school or in Science 101. And I'm dying to hear what those are. What do you feel that those?
Oh, yeah, that was 10 lessons not taught in Sunday school or Science 101, and coming from psychical research. And number one was there is compelling evidence that consciousness survives death. I mean, we don't hear that. I mean, in Sunday school, all you hear is, that you've got the Bible, and you have to take the Bible on faith, and that's it. But psychical research gave us some evidence. It's not, it's not absolute 100% certainty, but it certainly meets the legal standard, the minimum legal standard of preponderance of evidence. And to me and to many, it goes, beyond a reasonable doubt.
Absolutely. I feel the same way, too. But you got to dig for it. And that's one reason I think your books are so terrific for people to read, because there's so much meat in them that and seeing how everything corresponds, it's impossible. The laws against chance, the possibility that that's not real, I think is almost vanishingly small.
Right.
So let's talk about another lesson that we get that way.
Yeah, well, the second lesson is that proof of God is not necessary to accept the evidence. I mean, everything you read these days is based upon an a priori belief that you have to identify God before you can talk about an afterlife.
Yes.
But all the research indicates first you identify the afterlife first, and if there's evidence for an afterlife, then you can go from there to God, but you don't go from God to the afterlife. It's just the opposite of what
that's right.
What the scientists and the media try to make it out to be. It's always God and the afterlife always go together when there's any discussion, and if you can't get past God, you never get to the afterlife.
Good point. Very good point.
And
there's
a passage in passage. Well, I'm going to say there's a passage in the Bible. I forget exactly in which book of the Bible it says, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God."
Right.
I don't know if that the reference was to be to that, but to me that's the whole key. Look for the kingdom before you start looking for God.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Well, actually, we're coming close to the end of our time. Maybe we'll have to save the others for the next time we speak. But I'm wondering what you think is the most important thing for people to take away from exposure to this evidence. What do you want people to know about what the work that you do?
Well, other than the fact that there is evidence, I mean, if you get past that point, if you accept the evidence, I guess the next big thing is to understand that the afterlife is not what I often refer to as the humdrum heaven and horrific hell of Orthodox
right.
religion. I mean, that we have so many people who claim to believe in an afterlife. The religious people, and the afterlife I got from my Catholic school days and a few Protestant churches I attended was, the afterlife was just singing Hallelujah, 24/7, floating around in clouds, and there's nothing more to it. But in all this, in the psychical research, indications are that the afterlife, and at least in the initial stages, is much like the life we're living right now. And, it's not humdrum. It can be horrific for the person who hasn't led a good life. He might not even realize he's dead. He'll it's initially like a nightmare to him, and it takes a while to awaken to his true condition. But I think that's the key point is, if you're going to think about an afterlife of floating around on clouds, I mean, that's not very exciting.
No, exactly. Or sitting around in a throne room with a harp. Yeah, forget about that. No, it is a rich and wonderful and beautiful life. It's much, much more fun than where we are now. And I just, it's impossible actually to die. I think that's the thing that struck me. The more I did research, the more I came to realize we don't even have a choice in this. We're going to go to the wonderful place. It'll be as you say, if you've lived a good life, it'll be extraordinarily wonderful. Oh, mm-hmm. Michael, I'm so glad we did this. And when is your book coming out? Your next one?
Because of the pandemic, it's uncertain. Some of the distribution channels and so forth. It was supposed to come out like the end of July, but who knows right now. It's with White Crow Books, and John said it'll probably be out during the summer, but he can't because of the problems with the pandemic that he can't say, he feels sure it'll be this year, but maybe this summer, but who knows.
Well, we're going to have Michael back when his new book is out. And little plug for White Crow Books. If you go to whitecrowbooks.com, you can find Michael's wonderful blog and learn more about his books. But John Beecher, who's the head of White Crow Books, is really doing a wonderful job of preserving this information. He works with the very best authors, and it's a British company. I just cannot say enough good things about John Beecher and White Crow Books. And Michael is more of the reason why I think they're so wonderful, because he's the kind of person they publish. Well, I'm so glad you were here today, and it's going to be time now for us to say goodbye, but we'll have you back probably in September or something once we're sure your book is out. Yay!
Well, thank you very much, Roberta. I appreciate it.
And this has been Seek Reality with Roberta Grimes, and I'm really glad you could be with us today. Please never forget that you are a powerful, eternal being. You never began and you never will end. And when you really get that, everything becomes better in your life. Next week, we're going to be talking to Eliyahu, I hope I get that right, Eliyahu Jian, who's the author of a book called The Laughing Billionaire, How to Become Rich and Happy. I mean, what could be better than that? Become rich and happy. And he's a Kabbalist. And the reason that I want you to know about him and his book is that he talks about many of the same principles that Jesus talks about. And, of course, we use the teachings of Jesus to try to grow spiritually. But there are some people, why I don't know, they associate Jesus with Christianity. Go figure. Christians ignore Jesus, so we're happy to teach what he taught. But if you'd rather know about others who teach the same thing, then please join us next week. I think you're going to enjoy Eliyahu and his beautiful, cheerful ruminations on how to become rich and happy, which really probably is the ultimate thing we can do on earth, although growing spiritually is supposed to be more important. Please join us next week. And this week, our wonderful friend Michael Tymn has been with us for the 4th time. He is the most venerable of the core afterlife researchers who are currently working. I love his work. I love what he does. Michael, you are so unassuming. I don't think you really make enough of the wonderful job that you're doing in preserving all this information and in such an enjoyable way. But the list that he's put together of this history, which I'm going to try to find a way to get to you, because I think it's a very important thing that you come to understand, that there is a huge history of this information that's been ignored. And the wonderful work that he did in putting together those 6 books, which if you read all 6, you will not be able to believe that it's even possible that you'll die. I think that's the biggest gift anyone could ever give you. And let's talk about the fact that science still ignores this stuff. The way they treat this is that spiritual stuff just doesn't exist. This is like seeing a puddle on the floor and saying you can really research all the walls, all the floor, but you can't look at the ceiling to figure out how the puddle got there. It makes no sense to cut out a major part of reality when you're trying to study reality. And that's going to end, but not nearly soon enough, frankly, for me. I'm fed up with it because it causes so much harm in the world. Fortunately, Michael is more graceful about it than I am. As you know, I have a lot of nonfiction books out. They're all available on Amazon, and you can get them through bookstores too. And the adult books are all available as audiobooks. If you want to talk with me about anything, just go to the contact block. There's a green contact block on robertagrimes.com and send me an email. I answer all my emails. It takes 2 or 3 days usually, but I can assure you I will answer your email, and I'll answer your questions. And on occasion, people say they really want to talk to me. We arrange a time for that. It's very important to me that you come to understand in your own way, in your own time, that your life really is eternal and there is only good news. So meanwhile, this has been Seek Reality with Roberta Grimes. Please enjoy and make the most of this coming week in our one reality, always knowing that you are a powerful, eternal being, and you, most of all in the universe, you are infinitely loved.
You've been listening to Seek Reality with Roberta Grimes. Roberta blogs and answers questions at robertagrimes.com. Join us every week as we explore what the afterlife evidence and modern science combine to tell us is true about the one reality we all share. Knowing the truth changes everything.